Hello everyone, this is the second video for this week. This video is going to cover an introduction to Restoration and 18th century literature, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Pilgrim's Progress and Pilgrim's Progress author by the end of the video. So let's take a look at the term restoration. Why do we call this restoration literature? So shortly after John Donne died in 1633, England was involved in this huge civil war. It lasted almost a decade. So from 1642 to 1651, there was this English Civil War. And the cause of this, there are several causes for this war. One of the causes for the war was this power struggle between King Charles I and the Parliament. So think if, our president and our Congress were fighting for control of the country. That's kind of what was happening in England. The king and Parliament were having a power struggle. Another cause for the war was from Charles I's wife. She was Catholic, and she was trying to impose her Catholic beliefs on the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church is Protestant. So she's trying, as the king's wife, she's trying to force her Catholic beliefs in the Anglican Church, and that caused a lot of angst, a lot of anger in the community. And Charles also was trying to overtake Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. He wanted Scotland, Ireland, and Wales to be under his control as king. So all three of these things together kind of created this English Civil War, where everybody in England had very different ideas about these three issues, and it caused quite a rift in society. At the end of the war in 1651, Charles II, this was Charles I's son, fled to England. And when Charles II was in hiding, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of England. So Oliver Cromwell wasn't the king, he was kind of the interim king. He was acting as the king in England. Until this restoration period began. So until the literature that we're reading began in 1660. So in 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne of England. So Charles I is dead and gone, and Charles II, Charles I's son, comes back in 1660 to England, and he restores peace in England, and that is why this era of literature is called Restoration literature. So let's talk about Oliver Cromwell for just a second. He was not royal. He wasn't royal, so when the royal family left, when Charles left, he was kind of the last man standing, so to speak. So he stepped in. He was converted to Puritanism. He was not Puritan before, but he believed in the importance of religious liberty. He believed that everybody had the right to believe whatever kind of religion that they wanted to believe and to worship however they wanted to worship. So that idea is a little different for the time, because we're talking about a king who thinks that everyone should worship exactly the same way that he worships. And if you don't worship the way he worships, then you're wrong. So this idea that everyone has this religious liberty or this freedom was pretty foreign to a lot of people in the area. Here is a video link. We won't watch it in this video, but you can go to the presentation and click on the video link. And it'll take you to a YouTube video that goes over Oliver Cromwell's life. He was killed, he was executed for some of the things that he did as leader. He ruffled a lot of feathers and he was executed. And then later on, he was remembered as kind of a hero, and there's a huge statue of him in England. So he's respected now, but he wasn't always respected. So let's talk about Charles II's reign. In your textbook, we're talking about Volume C. In your textbook, it says that Charles II kind of learned a lesson from the English Civil War. He kind of learned from his father's mistakes, and he learned about loyalty during the English Civil War, but that he also was really trying to be sneaky and consolidate royal power. He wanted the king to have more power over Parliament. He hid his Catholic sympathies. Sorry, his mother, Charles I's wife, was trying to impose her Catholic beliefs in the Anglican Church. So Charles II is very well versed in Catholic beliefs. So he was sympathetic towards Catholicism, and he tried to hide that, and in order to avoid the Parliament testing his faith, because Parliament is Anglican, they're Protestant, and Charles II's mother was Catholic, so he couldn't show favoritism towards Catholic people, because if he did, then the Parliament would lose faith in him. Except for one occasion called the Popish Plot. You can read more about that on page 2179 in your book, but basically the Popish Plot was a rumor that centered around Catholic ideas that got started to test whether or not Charles II was going to protect Catholic people, or if he was going to protect the Anglican Church. Later on, Charles II dissolved Parliament, and this was terrible for the people in England because it caused a lot of turmoil. So think about it this way. Imagine that your country has just ended a decade-long war, and you think that things are starting to get better, the economy's picking up, people are building houses, people have jobs, people have food to eat, so things are starting to get better, and then you start to hear rumors that the new king, Charles II, is behaving the same way that the old king was before the war started. So people are scared of Charles II, and they're scared that his actions are going to send England back to another civil war that, frankly, no one has the money or the willpower to fight in. So people are scared in England at this time. So there are two sides to this restoration idea. So restoration, restoring England back to its greatness. We have winners and we have losers. So the winners of this restoration were people in the Anglican Church. So they very much believed that religion should be state controlled. So the government should control the religion of England. So after the Civil War, the state favored controlling religion. If everybody is forced to believe the exact same thing, then they thought that maybe it would stop people from having their own opinions and riling up society and causing another war. But then on the other side of the Restoration were the losers, or the dissenters. And these dissenters believed in a political republic and a freedom to pursue any form of religion that was outside of the state's control. Religion should not be controlled by the state. So they believed in political republic, so they wanted to vote in the people in power and not have just one king and then that king's son be king and then that king's son be king. They wanted to be able to vote for control, and they wanted to be able to practice religion outside of the lens of government. So these dissenters, or these nonconformists, they were the enemy, kind of. There were 18 different religious groups in England in the 17th and 18th centuries. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, which is your reading assignment for this section of literature, he was part of the Baptist group. There's a great article, if you click on A Tinker's Descent, A Pilgrim's Conscience, If you open the presentation and you click on the link, there's an article about dissenters and who they were, and what they stood for, and how they were successful in their plight to have religious freedom in England. But John Bunyan was one of these dissenters. And it's important to know that in 1689, the government kind of gave up on the idea of everyone in England being a member of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. But what they did was they passed the Toleration Act, which allowed dissenters and nonconformists the freedom to worship. So that was a huge win for the dissenters, because before 1689, it was illegal. It was illegal to practice religion outside of the Anglican Church. If you were Catholic, you could not practice Catholicism. If you were of any other religion that was outside of that Protestant Anglican religion, it was illegal for you to practice. But even though after 1689 they were allowed to practice their religion, if you were not a member of the Anglican Church, you were not allowed to hold political office. So you could not be a part of any kind of parliament or any kind of governing body of any kind if you were not Anglican. So that leads us to John Bunyan. So John Bunyan lived from 1628 to 1688. He was low class. He did not have a very in-depth education. He did not come from a lot of money. He was the son of a tinker. So a tinker basically is a traveling handyman. A tinker would travel around. They did not have a home. They would just live in their cart and travel from village to village. Mainly, they traveled around and fixed pots and pans, which is where the tinker comes from, because the sound of fixing pots and pans would make a tinker sound. But if no one had pots or pans that needed to be fixed, then they would do odd jobs, handyman type jobs in the village until they moved on to the next village, and that's how he lived. He lived through the English Civil War and experienced all of the political upheaval between Protestants and Catholics, and the fighting that was happening between Protestants and Catholics. He grew up to be a nonconformist preacher. So he really, I guess in today's terms, he would be more like a non-denominational pastor. He really didn't fit in with the Anglican Church, or the only legal church of the time. He didn't agree with a lot of their things, but he wasn't fully Catholic either. So he agreed with lots of different religious aspects from lots of different types of religions. So he that's where that nonconformist preacher comes from, because he believed he took a little bit of all of these religions and kind of meshed them together. He was imprisoned in 1660, and he remained in prison for 12 years. He was imprisoned for preaching without a license from the Anglican Church. So he was a very strong man. He stood up for what he believed in, even when it went against his government and the government's church. So I think that's an admirable aspect to John Bunyan. He wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And John Bunyan, he wrote it during his first imprisonment. And it's interesting because this book was written by a loser of the Reformation, or that dissenter of the Reformation. So this was kind of the first voice of the losers of the Restoration that the public really gets to experience. So in Pilgrim's Progress, what we see is this story is a biblical allegory, and we'll talk about what a biblical allegory means in just a second. But it's a biblical allegory, and compared to a lot of other literature at the time, it's pretty simple to read. John Bunyan, he was not very high in social status, so he did not have a good formal education. Most of the men who were writing in the 17th century had a formal education. So his writing is very different from their writing because he did not have a formal education. And he is writing to a different audience. Men who were educated in this time frame were writing to other educated men. So that's part of the reason why the vocabulary is so confusing or difficult to read. But because John Bunyan was not educated, he was not writing to educated men. He was writing to men like himself. So he was writing to the commoners of the time. In your textbook, it notes on page 2270 that the story is a basic metaphor, that life is a journey. And this, it's simple and familiar. The entire book of Pilgrim's Progress follows the spiritual and physical progress of Christian. So Christian is the main character. And he is a man who represents all people who follow Christ. And he goes through several locations that were common to English villagers in this time frame. So he is, Christian is all of the people in England that believe in God and the struggles that they go through. Everything that happens to Christian, even though it appears to be physical in the story, has a spiritual connection. So take falling into a ditch, for example. Falling into a ditch is a physical action, but spiritually it could also mean falling from grace or giving into sin, getting dirty, giving into sin. Another example of this spiritual connection in the story's plot could be if a character physically holds a heavy burden, they have a heavy package or a heavy bag, that burden is representative of sin. So that kind of goes back to this idea that Pilgrim's Progress is a biblical allegory. So there are different types of allegories. There's a classical allegory, and that is ancient Greek and ancient Roman philosophers, where they talk about animals or other things to demonstrate why humans exist. So Plato's allegory of the cave, if you've heard of that or read that before, that's an example of a classical allegory. A biblical allegory is it shows stories used in the Bible to create or convey Christian teachings. So you definitely see biblical themes such as the conflict between good and evil in biblical allegories. The characters in biblical allegories are representative of biblical men and women. Items and experiences in biblical allegories are representative of biblical items or experiences that are told in the Bible itself. So Pilgrim's Progress is a biblical allegory. We also have medieval allegories. Those allegories represent the unity of Christianity, and then modern allegories use stories about animals or birds to depict themes like the Chronicles of Narnia. Uses, Aslan is the lion, and he kind of represents the Christ figure. So that is a modern allegory. George Orwell's Animal Farm is also considered a modern allegory. So that is kind of it. The end of Restoration literature kind of brings about 18th century literature, which we will talk more about next week. But one thing that you should know is after you read Pilgrim's Progress, you will have some questions as part of the quiz on this week's assignment. So the first half of the quiz will be about John Donne and George Herbert's poetry, and then the second half of the quiz will be about Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. So if you could please get the reading done and then get your quiz submitted on time, and if you have any questions at all, please let me know. Thanks.